So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. And thank you to the NYU Center on International Cooperation for organizing this presentation. My name is Paul Ronan. I'm the Director of Research and Policy at Invisible Children, and I'm joined from Bangui, Central African Republic by my colleague, Camille. Camille, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. I'm Camille Marie Regnault. I'm the Deputy Country Director for Invisible Children in the Central African Republic.
Great. So we have a presentation today that we're going to go through with some slides, some videos, some maps, try to keep it lively to help everyone as they get their morning or afternoon going. So I'm going to share my screen. While I'm doing that, Camille, would you mind pasting the link, just in case folks don't have it, to the Google Doc where questions can be entered, or if folks have questions during the presentation, you can put them into the chat as well. We're going to do about 25 minutes or so on the presentation, which should leave us plenty of time for a good Q&A. All right, so I'm going to share my screen, and then Cassandra, it looks like people are continuing to join, so I think you should be able to admit them, and then I'll just kind of go from there. Great. So what Camille and I are going to be talking about today is community-based early warning systems in remote regions of Central Africa. Before we get going, I want to show a short video that talks about the event that really inspired Invisible Children to start working with our partners on this work. Just as a warning, there are graphic descriptions of violence in this video.
17th, 2009. The Lord's Resistance Army, a Ugandan rebel group, carried out a horrific attack in the Makombo area of Otuele district in northeastern Democratic Republic of Congo on the 14th of December. A group of about 20 combatants. They moved up the road and they passed a woman and they asked her, "Excuse me, ma'am, is there a school nearby where kids might be studying?" And they were pretending at this time to be Congolese army soldiers. And she said, "No, school's not in session." And they said, "What about a church? Is there a place where people might be gathered together praying?" And she said, "No, it's not Sunday. People aren't in church." And they said, "What about a market?" And she said, "Oh yeah, there's a fisherman's market just up the road there in the Banga Yatalo." So the LRA combatants moved up the road to this fisherman's market, and the LRA surrounded them and tied people up and looted goods and then marched them back into the forest along the path. And all along the way, they started killing people that they had abducted and leaving a trail of death behind them. Most people were chopped to death with heavy wooden sticks, and others were tied to trees before their heads were chopped with axes. Just before they got to the village of Tapili, a chief there got a message that maybe something was happening in the villages up the road, but it wasn't at all clear. So he, the chief, went with a Congolese army soldier by motorcycle in the direction of where they thought something weird was going on. And there they were ambushed by the LRA. The LRA killed both of them and gouged his eyes out and burned their motorcycle. And then they entered the town of Tapili, abducted many more people there, and killed others and continued along their route. In total, as I said, 345 killed, another 250 abducted. And this is, it took weeks and months for people to respond and really understand the scale of what happened in the Makombo area. If there were communications, if there were a way for the people in Mabanga Yatalo, in Makombo, and Tapili villages to report somewhere and let them know that there was this attack going on, and if there were people able to respond to help protect them when there is an attack, then maybe all of those people might not have been killed and abducted.
So the Makombo massacres were, as I said, kind of the event that really pushed Invisible Children to work with partners first in this region of northeastern DRC, and then later expand into neighboring regions of Eastern Central African Republic and Western Equatoria in South Sudan. Well, we originally had a focus on the LRA issue. What we found as time evolved is that there were many needs, many other armed groups that later moved into the region. So our work has broadened well beyond that kind of LRA focus. And you can see on the right of my screen some of the projects and donors that have helped us to expand into these areas, including the USAID-funded Community Resilience in Central Africa activity, and a U.S. State Department DRL Bureau early warning and atrocity prevention project that focuses on Eastern CAR. So Camille, over to you to talk a little bit more about the conflict dynamics here.
Thanks, Paul. So the region Invisible Children has been working in has historically been the center of violence, be it intercommunal, but also cross-border violence. And with the presence of armed groups being able to basically roam freely and wreak havoc without risking any retaliation from state or security actors in the region, because communities are extremely isolated, and it's actually complicated for any security forces to move around in that area. And so one of the things that local civil societies have been trying to put in place because of this extreme isolation and the weak state presence is that they started using HF radios to be able to communicate between communities and to start informing each other about what was happening in the region. And we're actually gonna go over to a small video from Abbé Benoit, whom we call the father of the early warning system for invisible children. He was the leader of a civil society structure we still work with today. So let's listen to Abbé Benoit.
Depuis 2006, je me suis donné corps et âme pour réfléchir sur comment pouvoir arrêter les atrocités de la LRA dans notre région. Que l'idée m'est venue parmi plusieurs idées que je pouvais utiliser pour pouvoir chercher, contribuer à ceux qui veulent que cette problématique termine dans la région. C'est ce qui m'a conduit à concevoir les projets d'alerte précoce. Et voilà que ce rêve s'est réalisé aujourd'hui.
Thanks, Paul. So the early warning system is basically composed of HF radios that we are helping to install in isolated communities. Once these HF radios are installed, we help the community to elect a peace committee who is going to be trained on the collection of information related to protection and to security, on rumor management, but also on participatory community mapping, where we basically ask and we facilitate sessions with the peace committee, where we try to show them how they can create a map of their community and try to identify the dividers and the connectors in the community so they can identify the threats that their community is facing. Once they've created this community map that you can see on the presentation on the left-hand side, they use this community map, and they list all the threats. And depending on the threats, they try to think of risk mitigation strategies that the community could put in place in order to reduce the exposure to these threats for the community members. And so we help them put together what we've called a community action plan, where this plan basically lists all the threats that a community might be facing and the potential risk mitigation strategies that they can put in place. And so it's a living document, really. The communities are able, once they start putting a risk mitigation strategy in place, if they realize that it didn't work, they're of course able to change this strategy so that they can adapt better to the community, to the situation of the community. And just as an example, we've had since January 2020, so we work in over 150 communities in DRC and CAR, and we've had 437 community responses across the different projects that Paul mentioned earlier, where communities were able to put in place risk mitigation strategies so that they would reduce their exposure to any threat that might be arising in their community. Paul, over to you for the prevention of atrocities.
Great, thank you, Camille. So we're going to talk a little bit about this model in relation to some concepts of atrocity prevention that are adapted from a very helpful USAID field guide that was released in 2015. We're going to talk about today just these top 3 ones, and we're going to go a little bit out of order and start with prevention. So one of the most important things about the early warning system is that over time that data allows us to identify trends in risks to civilians, and then understand better what are the dynamics that are feeding into those risks, and then we design interventions as far upstream of potential atrocities as we can to try to prevent future occurrences. One of the challenges, of course, in working in a region like this, where most communities don't have access to mobile phone service, internet, even FM radio, is how do you reach people? And in an area where there are a lot of potential flashpoints that are usually driven by armed group competition, economic issues, but fall along interethnic or interreligious or kind of livelihood-based fault lines. One of the programs that we found to be effective is sensitization that gathers the voices of respected civil society leaders to try to reduce tensions. So one of the ways that we do this was by adapting a technology, SD memory cards, that were being organically used within communities already to distribute pop music, movies, etc., into these remote communities, and then actually putting audio messages promoting peace and kind of targeting specific flash points on the SD cards and distributing them like that, which we have found to be effective. And then we took that actually a step further in a recent project that was a collaboration between our State Department DRL project and a private foundation, in which we had some Central African filmmakers actually go out to Eastern CAR and film a movie that kind of showed an example of how community leaders could reduce violence. So I'm going to show just a short clip from that now. And it was actually filmed all with local civil society leaders in the community of Bria.
So akinjoni potepe alimbi ifana soati njoni le getile kana tele so tatene ni la motene so ita timbi mais comme inga vrai gonda te tene na pe ikisar tongani timbi a jalo le litila zoni igweba kutazutala carrément fango zona itu kwa so a ondone awe sigina zo sona datimoso.
So as you can see, still some lessons learned and things that we can improve there. As I'm sure many of you noticed, all of the community leaders that were depicted in that scene were men. So I think that was a as that film developed, it was a great opportunity for for us to learn about what we might do differently in future initiatives. But we were it was certainly a great experience for us and our partners. Another way that we try to work. Oh, and sorry, this is just again on the SD cards. This shows an example of how a peace committee actually went out into walked several days out into the bush to a pole pastoralist wedding. In order to record traditional music that was then put on the SD cards, which was very important so that people from different ethnic groups and livelihood groups could kind of feel included in the SD cards. Another initiative that we support our partners on is negotiating compensation agreements when cattle are trample fields, which can help to reduce the chances that small incidents like that can trigger wider intercommunal tensions. Further downstream, closer to the potential atrocity, the HF radio early warning system can also be very helpful in warning communities of an imminent threat from an armed group. So this is an incident that I think shows how exactly what Ida in the video I showed at the very beginning was talking about how an early warning system could prevent atrocities in a situation where you have an armed group moving from community to community. So that was an example here in this infographic. Okay, Camille, back over to you to talk a little bit about kind of the more response and limiting consequences of atrocities.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. So in terms of responses, there are two ways that we are able to respond to any alerts that we receive over the early warning system. The first one is the immediate response. So whenever communities share, for example, a report about an imminent attack or of a large movement of an armed group, we're able to share this information with key stakeholders in the region, including some security forces. And the security forces are able to respond to protect civilians and community members. The other way that we respond to alerts that we receive is to interrupt a cycle of vulnerability. So, for example, you can see on the right-hand side of the slide a picture with 3 young men. So these 3 young men are former LRA fighters, Ugandans. They escaped from the LRA in a small community that is extremely isolated in DRC, a community called Banda. But upon their escape, they were extremely vulnerable because they once could have been re-abducted by the LRA group that they were actually escaping from, because the LRA does not want to lose any fighters, but they could have also been targeted by some community members because the LRA group they were in had actually been responsible for a number of attacks around the same community. So when we received the information about their escape, we were able to work with a local partner to evacuate them to a safer location while we were working with a partner in Uganda to try to find their families. And actually a few months later, they were repatriated to Uganda, and they were able to be reunited with their families. And Paul is going to show us a small video of their journey back home. It's actually pretty funny because they're listening to a song that they actually listened to while they were in the bush on SD cards that they had received. Thanks, Paul. So another example of a response that we were able to help coordinate. In this case, it was a bit more of an immediate response. Invisible Children and their local partners, Brialondo in northeastern CAR, were able to install an HF radio and train a peace committee in the community of Yalinga. And after the training, there were reports of a number of incidents and abductions by the LRA. And because the community kept being targeted by this LRA group, they communicated that information with the Chinko Reserve, who's also one of our partners in the Central African Republic. And the Chinko Reserve was able to organize overflights over the community of Yalinga and the surrounding areas to basically scare off the LRA, because we know that historically they've been scared of helicopters and planes and how they could target them. And following the overflight, Yonga was actually able to escape the LRA and walk to Yalinga, where she was welcomed by the peace committee, who's also been trained on psychosocial support for returnees. And yeah, after years of captivity, she was able to go home and be reunited with her family. Another example of immediate response, this time it's a cross-border example, where in between South Sudan and the Central African Republic. So the community of Source Yubu in South Sudan, I don't know, Paul, if you're able to show where it is exactly, is so it's actually really close to a Central African community called Bambuti, which is mainly controlled by the UPC armed group. And so the presence of that armed group in Bambuti had actually also created a lot of insecurity in the South Sudanese community. And there had been several cross-border atrocities, including UPC combatants raping South Sudanese women. And in retaliation to that, a South Sudanese armed group actually launched an attack on UPC forces in the community of Bambuti on the Central African side of the border, which resulted in the UPC carrying out more retaliatory attacks against South Sudanese who were in Bambuti. So the peace committee in Source Yubu in South Sudan responded to these cross-border threats by developing risk mitigation strategies. And some of these risk mitigation strategies included, because there had been a lot of gender-based violence, the peace committee sensitized the community to ensure that women would travel in bigger groups. And also they advocated to local officials and leaders to enforce laws that would restrict border crossing at night and in the early morning, because those were the times where people were quote unquote more easily targeted. And also the peace committee advised community members to send vulnerable groups from their community, so including women and children, to seek shelter in a different community further away from the border, so they would not be targeted anymore. So these are only a few examples that we have of responses to alerts that we're receiving over the early warning system. Paul, over to you to discuss how we communicate about these atrocities.
Great, thank you, Camille. So we've been talking a lot about kind of the horizontal function of the early warning system, of kind of facilitating communication between communities, which in the kind of immediate sense is really the most important function of the HF radios. What they also allow us to do over time, and as I said before, that we're getting into about the 11th year that we've been working with our partners on the early warning system in this region, is to really build up a database of incidents, so that we're not just doing the incident-based reporting, but we're also able to do more analysis. So on the incident-based reporting, we do this in a few ways. On the left here, you can see an example of an email alert that we send, and these types of alerts are important for ensuring that members of the diplomatic corps, UN agencies, other NGOs, national civil society leaders, et cetera, that are outside of the region, have access to even know that these types of incidents are even really happening, because they're again, because of the how disconnected this region is, many of the incidents that we're reporting wouldn't otherwise be known outside of the region. So we do the email alerts, like you see on the left. On the left of this screen, you can see an example of a WhatsApp alert that we send, which is for particularly urgent incidents. And then we also as we put a lot of effort into triangulating and trying to verify the information that is coming in over the daily HF radio calls, and what we've done is build what we call the crisis tracker, which used to be the LRA crisis tracker, but is now much broader. And this has, if I'm remembering correctly, which I might not be, about 2,500 conflict-related incidents are available on this site, most of which are restricted to people that have a user account, because some of the information about specific activity of certain armed groups we're not able to put out publicly. But as you can see, there are a lot of tools for helping people that do have access to identify trends in activity. So you can filter by incident type, by specific armed groups or armed actors, date, obviously, specific communities, regions, and then even you can search for incidents that affected, let's say, pastoralists or farmers, and then vulnerable groups as well, such as women and children. And as I mentioned earlier, the important part about all of this data and all of these trends is that it allows us to kind of feed into the prevention phase that we talked about earlier, where we're using this data to identify what are the flashpoints, what are the main risks, and then try to design interventions that get upstream of those as much as possible to try to reduce the chances that they'll reoccur. And then periodically, the data that we put out in the analysis gets picked up by the media, or in this case, on the right, the UN Security Council, a report to the Security Council from the Secretary General. I know we're running in just a little bit over time, so we've got one more quick slide before we get into the Q&A. And this is just kind of some of the key lessons learned and kind of looking ahead to future interventions. One of the things that we have found to be very, very helpful is that kind of vertical integration of the community-based atrocity prevention and response work with the reporting and the advocacy that gets done at the national level, the regional level, and the international level. Because having that foundation of credible information from the early warning network helps really to inform those efforts. Another one is really prioritizing local input and guidance to shape the tactics and technology that are used in these types of interventions. As I mentioned before, both the SD cards and the HF radios were really kind of ideas that came from our partners, but in a different region might be totally irrelevant. And then a third lesson is the importance of avoiding bureaucratic silos. You know, as the data that we've collected really shows, whether it's armed groups, illicit trafficking networks, patterns of forced displacement, all of these things tend to happen across borders. And if donors are kind of focused on you know, programs that have to happen in a particular country because that's where a funding pot comes from, they're many times going to be a step behind these types of interventions. So we have really appreciated the projects like the USAID CRCA activity that kind of bake in a cross-border component there. So Camille, over to you for one last point, and then we'll open it up to the Q&A.
Thanks, Paul. So yeah, this is directly related to prioritizing local input. This one thing that Invisible Children has been doing a lot is really investing long-term in local partnerships, because they're critical to the sustainability of any activity, even beyond specific projects or funded projects. And a lot of the work that has been done has been to be able to really make the peace committee and the local partners autonomous, so that they're able to carry activities and even adapt some of the activities to their specific realities, and to be able to keep reinforcing the resilience. That's already very, very strong for them. But yes, that's it. That's it from us. If you have any question, then we're here to answer them.
Great. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and check to see. Okay, so I see a question about providing links to the videos. I do think we have those links. I'm not sure if there's anyone from Invisible Children that is on the call that might have the links, at least to the two initial videos with Abe Benoit and the one about the Makombo massacres. I'm not sure about the third one, whether there's a public link to that, but thank you, Sunita, for that questions. And then I'm just reading through a question from John here about the difficulty of distributing cameras and smartphones for data collection and the risks that staff or civilians can be accused of being spies. This is definitely a challenge here, and I'm gonna ask Camille if you can respond to this, because you are you know, you have a lot of hands-on experience with managing these types of risks.
So it cut off a little bit, so I didn't hear the end of the question. Do you mean the targeting of communities who host the HF radios, right?
Yes. So the question was, how do you manage not to increase the risk of targeting communities and the staff who are hosting or using the HF radios?
Thank you. Yeah. So one thing that we do is that we always make sure that the HF radio, and when I say we, I mean the Invisible Children staff on the mission, but also the community members, because this really the HF radio really belongs to them once it's donated to them. And we always work with them to make sure that the HF radio is not too visible. It's actually pretty easy to hide. Even the big antenna is pretty easy to hide. So we always make sure that it's in an area that's not easily findable, if that's a word. Apologies if it's not. So that people will not be easily targeted, or the HF radio will not be easily targeted. And then the operators are trained on how to dismantle the HF radio fast as well and safely, so that they can, in case there's an incident, then they're able to dismantle some pieces of the HF radio, so that if the HF radio is stolen, they're able to at least take some pieces of the HF radio with them. But we always tell them that their safety and their life is more important than the HF radio. So yeah, we make sure that there's really big acceptance from the community on where the HF radio is located in the community. I hope this answers your question.
Yeah, no, thanks, Me. That was great. One additional point that I would add on to that is we have also found that it is that it's really important to really foster the sense that the HF radios are not an invisible children radio. They are a radio that was installed perhaps by invisible children, but is a community radio. So one of the manifestations of that approach is that the HF radios are used for a much wider range of communication than just sharing information about armed group activity or whatever. So in a lot of cases, particularly in Eastern CAR, we've seen some really innovative uses of the radios to act as kind of a banking system, where there was a challenge of traders having to travel with large sums of cash between remote communities and then being targeted by bandits and by armed groups. And then there was the beginning, or there was a community-led initiative to kind of use the HF radios as a banking system, so that traders didn't actually have to move cash physically from town to town, which reduced risk there. They're also used to do trainings for teachers that aren't able to reach a larger community, or share information on prices at different markets, or information about the death of a community leader. And what that does is it raises the cost of an armed group actually coming in to destroy or hurt the functioning of the early warning system, because a lot of people in the community have vested interest in that HF radio continuing to function. And a lot of these armed groups, even in Eastern CAR, where most of the communities are controlled by armed groups, they're fairly weak, and they kind of need to negotiate with community leaders their presence and justify to some degree what they are doing. So we have seen cases where armed groups have shut down one of the HF radios for a few days, but then community leaders really come in with a position of strength and say, you say all of these things about how you're representing our interest and all of this, but look at all of these things that the HF radio does, and you're not allowing it to really to operate. So that approach helps a lot as well. I'm seeing another question from Irene about where we get the data from the conflict tracker from, whether it's from the peace committees or databases such as ACLED. That's a great question. So a majority of our data comes directly from the early warning system, and then we try to triangulate that where possible with other sources, whether it be other civil society leaders, UN or NGO representatives, and then we do also have data where the primary source was perhaps a UN report, and then we triangulate that with the early warning system. And I'll just say quickly, you know, I have seen at times, usually from people that haven't been out and really spent a lot of time in these communities. Well, how can someone tell whether an armed group is the LRA or an ex-Seleka group or anti-Balaka? And certainly there are cases where community members aren't able to identify who the attacker was, but I think it can be dismissive of people living in these areas. I mean, their livelihoods and their lives often depends on being able to identify, particularly what armed group you know, is a threat to them. So they're very, very sophisticated, actually, often, not always, in being able to identify groups. And then just to answer the last part of that question, our data actually feeds into the ACLED database. So a lot of some of the information from this region that you would see on the ACLED site is coming from us. I think we have a hard cutoff rate at 1:45, so I don't know. I can screenshot these questions and follow up Mark and Sunita to make sure that we answer them, but I do know that we have a hard stop. So apologies to everyone for having to cut this off early and talking a little bit too much on some of the questions, I'm sure. Great, so thank you, everyone.